You were listening to episode 145 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Producer-director Russell Long speaks with us about his film Room to Breathe, about the teaching of mindfulness to at-risk youth. Inner-city schools are having problems. In many cities, about half of high school students drop out, and a similar percentage of teachers leave after just 5 years in the profession. The film Room to Breathe is a documentary about how mindfulness practice may help foster change. It follows Megan Cowan from Mindful Schools as she spends several months attempting to teach mindfulness in a San Francisco public middle school that tops the district in disciplinary suspensions. Russell Long is executive producer for the award-winning films Someplace with a Mountain and A Sheltered Sea. He is also executive producer of Sweet Dreams Rwanda and co-executive producer of The Island President. As an environmental activist earlier in his career, he founded the environmental group Blue Water Network and was responsible for numerous state and federal laws, including the United States' first law to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. He received his BA from Harvard, MBA from Columbia, and attended Columbia's graduate film program. He serves on the board of Friends of the Earth in Washington, D.C. So sit back, relax, and have a nice chai. Our guest today is producer-director Russell Long. Russell, thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, you're welcome. Happy to be here.
I wanted to ask about your background, which is a little different than most of the guests that we have on the podcast with filmmaking. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, in reality, I'm an activist. I've been an environmental and social activist for many, many years, and I had an environmental organization named Blue Water Network that we merged into Friends of the Earth. And I'm on the board of Friends of the Earth, but I started doing films 4 years ago. Specifically, the first one, and the one that I've worked on during that whole period, has been on kids learning mindfulness. And it's something that I practiced since I was a kid myself, since age 14 when I first learned TM. And then as I went to college, I learned mindfulness with Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein, and it's just been a big part of my life, and I've always wanted to circle back and do something with it. And when I first learned about mindful schools in Oakland, I thought this is a great opportunity. They're working with struggling kids all around the Bay Area and really all around the country, and a lot of them come from very challenged backgrounds, and they range in age from literally down from K all the way up to 12th grade, so really about 5 years old upwards. So it's a big, broad spectrum. And the impacts that I saw from that program were incredibly pronounced, and they continue to be. So preliminary studies are now showing much greater attention. The kids get better at calming behaviors. We see increase in socialization skills. They just don't have angry outbursts like they did before they learned mindfulness. And as a result, bullying and violence is down in the populations that are being taught mindfulness amongst all these age groups. And so, when I started out with the film, initially I hired someone to go ahead and make the film. We started doing that film in Oakland. I was the executive producer. And as we went along, I began to realize this isn't turning out right. We had a couple of kids were focused on this character-driven, and the kids did not have problems that were specifically related to their schooling. It really had to do with other factors. It was things like, one kid's dad had died from cancer, and he was a fifth grader, and he used mindfulness to help him calm down and relax and cope. We had another girl who had a traumatic situation with her boyfriend, and it was a rape situation, and mindfulness allowed her to recover from a suicide attempt after that. And, powerful as it was, I thought, no, this isn't actually what's going to help our kids in school today. It'll help in many other ways, but we need a different kind of film. So I started with a whole separate project, and I directed this film, Room to Breathe, on my own. I'd never directed before, so that was a very challenging experience. But we focused in on the most troubled kids from the most troubled classroom in San Francisco, seventh graders who are primarily from immigrant families, Asian, Hispanic, and also African American kids. And they just were having such challenges in their school. And when we first walked in, I saw 36 kids in one classroom with one adult. And there were about 6 kids who were incredibly challenging to the teacher. And at different points, he would say to us, I can't teach these kids. And I've been doing this a long time, and there's no way with all these children and so much disruption that I can take them where they need to go in terms of their study and their learning. And so he welcomed the introduction of mindfulness into the classroom. And, you see in the film that the level of disruption is insane. I mean, it really is. And chronicle of it, I think, very well. We filmed in the classroom for probably about 4 weeks before mindfulness came into the room. And then, bit by bit, we see Megan Callan, who is the primary teacher, begin to get some impact with these kids. It took a while because, frankly, they were defiant to her as well. There was a lot of oppositional defiance in that classroom, and she had to really struggle with them for quite some time. But after about 3 or 4 weeks, she made some headway, and bit by bit, we see them begin to calm down. And the transition is it's remarkable. There was a point in the filming where I actually thought, this isn't working. The film is just going to be a disaster. It's going to be like the first one. We're going to walk out of here, and the kids will not get it. They're too troubled. It isn't going to happen. And then, lo and behold, right before our eyes, the shift began to occur. Almost, we didn't even really know how. It was something magical in it.
During the filming itself, as I was watching it, because I have a copy of the film here, and I watched it 2 days ago, I know that Megan expressed some frustration, that she was running into a brick wall, and she was exactly as you're describing. It was very difficult, and it didn't seem like they were reaching the kids, but then, and you presented this very well in the film, you see a subtle shift that as Megan rings the bell, and as she brings up the kids to do it themselves, they start to calm down, and it's almost a reflexive action of they hear the bell and their mind starts to quiet. Is there anything that you can think of as a meditator yourself, and having been doing this for quite some time, that you would attribute to as the turning point of what it was? Was it just a culmination of the ongoing determination of everyone involved? What caused that shift?
Well, there were 2 factors. The first one is the one you mentioned. I think having the kids actually go up to the front of the room and ring the mindfulness bell, as we called it, really helped to get them focused. It's like one of their peers is doing it now, so they can buy into it. suddenly the whole room becomes part of it. They're watching their peer. They're like, is he going to do it right? Is he going to hit it too hard? Is he going to start laughing? What's going to happen? So there's a moment of drama there for them. And the second issue is that we took 4 of the most troubled kids out of the classroom. So Megan led that, and the school administrator said, look, we got to teach all kids equally. There's no special treatments, and nobody's excluded. But if you want to take them out for a little while and have them do something else and then slowly reintegrate them, then that's okay. And those kids didn't want to be there. It's not like they were forcibly removed. So they left the room. And then later in the film, we don't really harp on it, but they're slowly brought back into the room, and they do buy in. They do become part of it. And one of them, very remarkably, in exit interviews after it was all over, said to me, this film changed my life. Learning mindfulness and having you guys here, all of this, helped me to really change and shift the way I am with my parents, the way I am with my peers, and it's been very important to me. And so, that was nice to hear because there was a moment where we thought it was all going to fall flat on its face.
In the extras to the film, you conduct interviews, you have testimonials from 6 of the students that appeared in the film. What about their interviews, their testimonials, stood out most for you about their experiences?
Well, interestingly, we didn't know that mindfulness was working so well with all of these kids because they're very quiet, especially I think at around age 13 when they're in 7th grade. They don't necessarily share a lot. They have their own little private inner world. They don't want to let everybody know what's going on. This is the time when kids get tough with each other, and so they bury it in there. And suddenly in these interviews we did 41 kids, and almost across the board, I'd say 95% of them said mindfulness on some level had been very, very powerful for them. And that was very gratifying to hear.
You also have interviews with 3, I think, fairly recognized names. Megan herself, who's the director of Mindful Schools. And for people who are listening to the podcast, I do have links on the episode page to this episode to Mindful Schools, so I'll be able to get that to you as well. I really liked that particular interview, and I'll get to the others in just a moment, but let's talk about Megan's first. She does a really nice job of describing some of the exercises that were done in class that weren't in the film directly itself, and some of the intent behind those. Was there a pre-planned decision to have that interview so that those additional pieces could be shared?
No, that wasn't pre-planned. But in putting everything together at the end, I realized there had to be some bonus material for people to understand how to implement this in a classroom, particularly for teachers, to get some more background. And, it's not like a traditional narrative film where you can go in and describe everything in great detail. This is a character-driven film. We follow 4 kids very closely. We go into their homes, we meet their families, their parents talk about them, we see them participating in activities with others. And so there isn't that opportunity to provide the kinds of pedagogical learning tools that Megan and Jon Kabat-Zinn and Dan Siegel presented towards the end in this bonus section.
Yeah, let's talk about those interviews a bit too. Dan Siegel has been a guest on the podcast, and we'll be bringing him back to talk about a recent book of his. Tell us a little about that conversation with Dan and some of the information that he presented in his interview in the extras.
Well, I think he brings a wonderful perspective, which is the science side of this thing and how the brain processes this information when one is doing mindfulness, and the role of the prefrontal cortex, the role in which it calms down the brain and allows kids to focus and to re-engage and to calm down. And I think that's something. The scientific piece is so important for educators to understand, because right now I think we have a disconnect between the kind of teaching that kids are expected to acquire and this lack of inner reflection. And that's actually where Jon Kabat-Zinn speaks very eloquently too. He talks about the need for the fourth R. So it's reading, writing, arithmetic, and reflection, inner reflection. And we see time and time again that when kids are given that tool to go inside themselves and to calm themselves, suddenly learning is accessible to them again. Whereas before they may have felt too disrupted, or they're caught up in fighting with some of their peers, or someone's bullying somebody or whatever, or sometimes it's just a personality difference between them and their teacher. And then when they go inside and then they reemerge out of that, they're present for the first time, maybe all day, and they can focus. And we're hearing that from the teachers too. It's critical that we have that kind of thing in classrooms across the country today. And it doesn't necessarily have to be mindfulness. My feeling is all these social and emotional learning programs provide excellent tools. They're all a little bit different, but the calming aspect of them and the focusing aspects are so important to be able to allow our kids to re-engage with their learning again. And that's something that we have lost so much of, especially with No Child Left Behind and all the testing protocols. So this is the piece, I think, that will allow the kids to, once again, engage with their school environments instead of having it just be a social experience.
Is that one of the intents or things you'd like to see out of this work and the film, is to raise that awareness and present possibilities for making that change?
I think that's ultimately the value of this film, and that's really why I did this film, is because I think we have a tremendous disconnect right now from ourselves, from our family and our peers, and from Mother Nature, from the natural world. I think that it's all interrelated, and I think that the sooner we get back in touch with ourselves, the sooner we'll be able to reintegrate ourselves into families, into our culture, into our natural world, and I think that will allow us to help causing as many problems as we do as human beings. I think if everybody learned to meditate, the world would be a far, far more civilized and less violent world to live in. And the easiest place to start really is with our children, because our children are like sponges. Once they get this material, we see them shift in remarkable ways in just 6 weeks. It's stunning. Whereas if you took a group of adults, it'd probably take years before you begin to really notice shifts in an adult and in their brain and behavior. But the kids, it happens, bam, quick as lightning. So that's where we need to go.
Yeah, and you're right. I agree with you completely. And it was interesting to note that this wasn't like, say, for example, an 8-week MBSR program where there's a commitment to meditate every day and there are long periods of instruction and a full comprehensive explanation of this. Megan didn't have that opportunity. It was 6 weeks. She was only in classroom once or twice a week for short amounts of time, and yet the effects, you captured this on camera, where there's a scene in the schoolyard where one of the kids uses the techniques of mindful breathing, was a particular technique used, to not go in a direction that would have otherwise led to a fight. And she talked about that afterwards, that was very helpful to her, that she made a different choice. And so you're right, the kids seem to, even the ones who are most challenged by this, because this is one of the ones that you followed, really do very well with this.
Yeah, it's true. And we're very lucky to capture that incident in the yard and then have her description later on and put them together. I mean, there were a few serendipitous moments like that in the filming process. But yes, I think it's remarkable that kids adapt so quickly. And I think in part their brains are just not stuffed with information and advice from years or decades worth of people talking at them. They're still pretty open to things, and they're willing to give it a go and experiment, and I think that's why schools are the best place to be. And of course, they are our future. So if we can help shift the way that they think and the way they respond and adapt to things right now, I think it'll make a tremendous difference around the world.
There's also something that you did in there which was a little surprising, and I'm really glad that this was part of the program, is that it wasn't just the students and Megan, it was also the teachers and the guidance counselor who were part of this. And you have regular interviews with them, but it's interesting in your the filming of the sessions of quiet mindfulness of breathing and the ringing of the bell and the instructions, that the teachers are right there and they're sitting with the students, and they're sitting with the students that you've already set the stage that there are problems there. And did you see any fundamental shifts with the teachers as well during this program?
I think so. And it's funny because the primary teacher that we had in the classroom with all the troubled kids is, he's cynical about things like this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He was open enough to allow it to come into his classroom as an experiment, but he began to shift. We could see it. I mean, he himself began to become calmer and, more responsive with the kids, and not quite as quick to judge them, and not so fast sending them out of the room when there was a problem. And yet when I asked him, do you think this has changed you in any way? He says, no. And then I asked the kids, and the kids said, oh, yeah, he changed. There's no question. We could see that. So I thought that was interesting. There was another teacher we're involved with as well, and she did acknowledge the changes in herself, that she felt calmer and more focused and more able to be present with the kids. But I think, Mindful Schools has a story about one teacher who admitted after she learned mindfulness herself that she'd been at the point of burnout after 5 years in the profession, and she was on the verge of quitting, and decided to stay because mindfulness changed her relationship to her teaching. And because she could help influence her kids with it and teach them, it changed everything. The whole dynamic in the room, in her classroom, changed. And this is a very important factor when you look at a profession where the burnout rate is 50% after a 5-year period of time. So half all the teachers in this country quit the profession after 5 years. That's the data. If we can take all that energy that they put into becoming teachers and transform their relationship to teaching, transform those classrooms through SEL programs like mindfulness, we'll see much greater career longevity, much better teaching, more committed teachers, happier teachers, and I think it'll trickle all up and down, everywhere within the educational sector if we get to that point.
Now, you've been doing work of this kind for some time in environmental issues, and I wanted to ask about what you're working on now, because some of your previous work on Someplace with a Mountain, Sheltered Sea, Sweet Dreams Wanda, things like that. Tell us a little bit about the work you've done in the past and what you're working on next.
Well, I've been involved with a handful of films as either an executive producer or producer, and this is the first time I've actually directed anything. But, my work is really that of a social activist. I don't really consider myself a filmmaker per se. I'm looking for the opportunities to go and make a difference in helping there be some improvement in the world in various places where I see an opportunity. And I did that for many years with environmental work, and I might go back and do something there as well, or do some filmmaking there. But I don't have a specific project in mind at the moment. I'm focused upon getting Room to Breathe out there, maximizing exposure, getting it out on PBS, and a bunch of film festivals across the country too. So we'd love support from festivals that would like to have us, and we'd certainly love to get support from folks on Facebook liking us and circulating our links. And ideally, we're going to have a campaign built around this so that parents across the country are engaged in trying to support SEL programs like mindfulness in their schools, that they'll band together. Perhaps they'll rent the film together, show it to administrators, or even donate it to their school, and try to get a movement going and build that movement so that we'll see mindfulness and other SELs programs inside schools across the nation. And I think that's really where we can have a huge impact. And I'm going to put my energies there for a while.
Yeah. And you put a very good spotlight on that aspect of it, that this is a key driver of the social change that many of us would like to see, particularly in our youth, and the care for what they're going through. I don't think any of us saw the scenes of walking through the high school locker without a note of trepidation and stress in our own youth. And this really helps raise that awareness that, there are things we can do. They are completely secular, and they are simply tapping into our abilities with our brains and using that functionality and the way our brains work to make better experiences, to help us make better decisions moment by moment.
Yeah, that's very true. And the more we give those tools to our children right now, the better the decision making, the better their lives and their outcomes are going to be. Their achievement levels will probably increase in whatever parameters they've set for themselves. And I think it's going to be culturally a very positive thing.
Russell, at the end of the movie, when it's closed and before the credits, there are a number of very good statistics that are on the DVD, and I was wondering if you had a few of those handy, if you're aware just of some of the positive improvements that these students, at least in this film, have seen.
I don't have them right in front of me, but I can tell you that over 80% of the kids feel that mindfulness was very helpful to them and believe that it should be offered to all other kids. I think over 60% felt that they were able to use it to calm down, and they had more control over themselves and their emotions and behaviors. I think a third of them said that they avoided fights using it or that it increased their grades. And so across the board, we see some very, very strong support, quantitative support, though it is subjective, but the teachers verify it. They say, yeah, this is pretty much what I'm seeing too. So I think it's pretty clear what's happening in there, and it's all positive.
Excellent. And for those who are interested in finding out more about what we've been talking about today, there are a few links that I will have on the episode page for this episode, but I did want to read a few of the websites for those of you who are listening through iTunes. First is about the film itself, and that's roomtobreathefilm.com, and that will tell you all about the film itself and has a number of video clips on it. And also the subject of the film, mindfulschools.org, also has some wonderful resources for those who are interested. To get the film itself, to get a copy of it, is on videoproject.com/roomtobreathe.html. And Russell, also your Friends of the Earth website, is that FOE.org?
That's correct.
Excellent. Well, our guest today has been producer-director of the film Room to Breathe, Russell Long. Russell, thank you very much for being here.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.